As the world moved towards the Second World War, between 1938 and 1941, Germany annexed Austria and formed alliances with Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania and Italy, and conquered Western Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. By June 1941, they had control of much of North Africa and had captured Greece, Crete and Yugoslavia. In the same month, the Germans and their allies invaded the Soviet Union. This began the War on the Eastern Front, known to the Russians as the Great Patriotic War. It was to dwarf any war before or since. One of its most grueling episodes took place in Leningrad. In 1941, Leningrad had long been displaced by Moscow as the Soviet Union's political capital. But it remained a vital centre of Russian scholarship, literature, art, music and ballet. As St. Petersburg since the early 18th century, and Petrograd during World War I, it had been the embodiment of Tsarist Russia's imperial power. The cradle of the Russian Revolution of 1917 renamed Leningrad on the death of the first Bolshevik leader. It was anathema to Adolf Hitler, the Germans' fascist leader. It was also home of the Kirov Works, a key centre of Soviet tank production, and the only Soviet port on the Baltic Sea. Some Leningraders lived in fear of the authorities, but Communist Party members were enjoying a standard of living comparable with any Western city. None of its 2.5 million citizens could have foreseen that 1 in every 3 would soon perish. In August 1939, the Soviets entered into a non-aggression pact with Germany, signed by Foreign Ministers Molotov and Ribbentrop. The Soviet leader Stalin may not have expected the pact to hold indefinitely, but he needed time to repair the damage his 1930s purges had inflicted on the Red Army. He treated as near treason any suggestion that he should prepare for an immediate German attack. According to the secret terms of the pact, Germany invaded Western Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and the Soviet Union invaded Eastern Poland just 8 days later. The ease with which he was able to annex it, and the Baltic states within a year, did nothing to diminish Stalin's false sense of security.
Historians still argue whether Stalin was negligent, or whether he believed that his apparent inaction would allow him to anticipate the German invasion with a Soviet incursion into Nazi-held territory. He almost certainly believed the pact would induce Hitler into a long war with the Western powers, which would ultimately defeat the Third Reich and allow the Soviet Union to annex most of Europe. But we do know that he ignored reports from his own secret services, particularly the NKGB, who had received good intelligence of imminent German attack, and information from British sources made available through the breaking of the Enigma Code. Stalin believed the British were trying to persuade him to attack the Germans so that they were no longer resisting the Reich alone.
Given Stalin's attitude, it was no surprise that Andrei Zhdanov, the Leningrad Communist Party chief, had left for his holiday on the Black Sea 3 days before the attack.
Zhdanov was a typical Bolshevik party man and protege of Stalin. Born in 1896, he had joined the party in 1915 and won Stalin's trust by being an enthusiastic supporter of the purges. From 1935, he became a member of the military Soviets of Leningrad, then the Navy and the Northwest Front. By 1941, he had risen to be party chief. He suffered from cardiac asthma, which made him habitually breathless and caused him to suffer from swollen ankles. Whether or not this prevented him from taking exercise, he was considerably overweight, which the siege of Leningrad did not appear to correct.
What's up, guys?
Howdy.
How's it going?
hit
That was pretty good.
Soviet
See, we lost the war.
killing nearly 1,000
Oh, yeah, we
Soviet
got
aircraft
fucked.
on the ground.
You lost the war?
300 in the air.
Yes, we did. Yeah, we lost all of our middle territories and all of our
Hitler planned to
like
overwhelm
defensive
Soviet
territories in
forces
24
as he
hours.
had French, Belgian and British armies the previous summer, in a swift campaign codenamed Barbarossa, after the 12th century king of Germany and Pope Rome.
Yeah, I was the quartermaster at Rhinewood on, I want to say Friday, and they shelled me for an hour and a half.
Yeah, I was all up in the middle of it on a couple occasions.
Under the protection of the Luftwaffe, German tanks
Yeah, it was a rough fight.
swarmed into Poland,
New war happens tomorrow at 11, man.
and the Soviet republics of Ukraine and Belarus. Stalin was so stunned by the Nazi assault that he delegated Molotov to inform the Soviet people via the public radio system installed in every city. His speech prompted a run on the state bank in Leningrad and panic buying in its food shops. But the following day, over 100,000 Leningraders swarmed to mobilization points and joined up. By the end of the week, the total had grown to over 200,000.
Following Molotov's announcement,
Yeah, towards the end of the war, I really didn't see the point. I was just grabbing a lot of machine gun ammo and heavy machine guns and camping foxholes and mowing guys down as many as I could.
soon followed by key elements.
That's all you could really do.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of fun, you know. There was no hope in doing Logi. People kept trying to get me to do Logi, and we kept getting massacred in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, I was up in Fairnet. With the whole fucking Logi train wreck that was up there before we lost it. Not a whole lot of fun.
With continued command of the skies, the Germans were able to break through successive lines of defense on the western frontiers.
I'm glad I haven't really heard any Howie shells drop on me in the last 2 days. No more flashbacks.
3 weeks after the start of Operation
Yeah, I have to take my headset off sometimes.
1,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft.
Turn the shit
Oh,
down.
okay.
By the 9th of July, the Soviet Union's western front had lost nearly 300.
No, I mean when the Howie shells are coming in all the time.
Oh,
Everybody's
yeah,
chattering.
yeah.
By the middle of August, German forces were marching on Leningrad itself, utterly
Yeah, I can't even hear myself fucking think when those things are going off next to me.
In 1941, the Soviet Union was a federation of industrial countries, was only 19 years old. Many of its citizens were glad to see the own community and welcomed the Germans as liberators, especially in Ukraine and the Baltics, which had only recently been annexed by the Soviet Union with Hitler's consent.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind
following
riding
the
around with us. We're kind of just winging it.
I don't care. I usually don't play the resistance phase. I was just checking it out.
hoped that the Germans would give them more independence than they were allowed as part of the Soviet Union. Not least because
This is a great way to check it out, I guess.
so many of them to Siberia.
Yeah, we're actually trying to find an AC. Or make an AC. We have the maps for it, but we need a speed inspector.
I can follow you in the Jeep if you want.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, as you can probably imagine, there's not a whole lot to do.
Yeah, that's why I usually don't do it.
As a result, there was a flood of people fleeing the invasion.
We just had somebody come up and was like, "Oh, you want to use RMAX?" And I was like, "I'm not gonna tell you no."
Do we even get any benefit yet for the resistance, or is it just kind of a waste of time middle
Well,
thing?
we get something called Strong Max, which you can use to build like supply crates, and you can stockpile certain items for use in the next war.
Okay, so there is some benefit.
The Finns were advancing towards Leningrad.
Yeah, kinda. I'm
That's good at least.
not the
They
biggest
joined the
fan of it.
Germans in their attack on the Soviet
I
in order to recover territory they had lost in the winter war they fought against the Russians from 1939 to 1940.
With the consent of Hitler, also given the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin had invaded Finland in 1939. The Finns outfought the Soviets in the beginning, but but in the end were defeated by overwhelmingly superior resources and lost nearly 1/6 of their territory. Fear of future reprisals from their much more powerful neighbour was to convince the Finns to limit their military ambitions to regaining territory which they believed was legitimately theirs.
The Leningrad leadership
I
was
cannot
based
build
in
an
the
armored
small,
car here either.
which in Tsarist times had been a smart.
Do you
fortress
need
for
a
Hitler.
blueprint every time you build one?
On the 24th of August 1941 was the Germans.
Yeah, I think so.
Bosses formed a
Me and a guy were
Leningrad
talking about that the other night. He was all pissed because he had to
somewhat
create a stack
comical
of them.
message from Stalin. Only the
Jeez.
government
It takes
can
forever to
make
create a
a
stack,
military
too.
defense Soviet.
I have no idea how to
We
make a
ask you
blueprint, so
not
that is
to
beyond
commit
me.
such an offense again.
I don't even know if you can do it in this phase because
Hundreds of
you have to have
thousands of
a main
ordinary
town.
Leningraders were drafted in to build a line of
Yeah,
fortifications from the
I
outlying towns of Kingsepp
I really
and
don't want to have
Luka,
to drive all the way
right
to like a
outskirts of
port
Leningrad.
base, but if it was up to me, I would drive an AC all the way up to reaching trail and just mess around for a little bit. But
That sounds like a good idea.
Field Marshal von Lee, the German army commander attacking Leningrad, had at his disposal 500,000 men and 1,500 tanks. These soon broke through the Luga line and advanced on the city. Now the area around Leningrad was within range of von Lieb's artillery.
I wish there was a front line.
But Hitler
Like there's like
and the
no
German High
fighting.
Command were so concerned
Every
by
town
the
that we've
implications
taken,
of
we've
feeding
taken
the
with
city's
little to no
population of over
resistance.
2.5 million.
Is there any
that they
enemy
hesitated
on
to
at all?
commit its
Can you
forces
tell?
to occupying the city.
I don't know. I haven't seen any.
Hold on, I have a war report. I'll
This
check.
morning.
If you don't have the Android app, it's awesome.
No, I don't have it. I'll go with it.
Von Lieb's forces were moving towards Ladoga, the huge lake to the east of Leningrad, driving a wedge between Russian forces.
Yeah, we took Lochmeyer
They captured the railway junction town of Magar,
about
and on
15
the 8th of
minutes ago, and
September
I didn't
reached
see
the
a
southern
single
shore of
order.
Lake Ladoga, where they occupied Schlisselburg at the mouth of the river Neva. This meant that the Germans had now cut off all overland supply lines between Leningrad and Moscow, and with the Finns were forming an iron ring around the city. Capture of Schlisselburg.
Yeah, it's
convinced
glitched
Hitler's
out.
Chief of Staff, Franz Halder,
I guess it doesn't work in the
Leningrad was
resistance
about to be
phase.
Damn, that sucked.
Hitler had decided as early as the 8th of July 1941
Well,
to erase Moscow and Leningrad
we
in order
had
to prevent
a
them
resistance
staying
base
there,
behind
whom
lines
we
in
will then
Westgate
have to
yesterday
feed in winter.
that was getting sacked, and
cities
then
are to be
devs were like,
destroyed
"Oh yeah,
by
by the way,
Air
we're
Force.
we're
Tanks may not be
taking all
used for
the
this purpose.
West Coast territories offline," and I was like, "Great!" And since then, like, there's been nothing to do. I think
I'm gonna go see if there's any guns in this safe house.
Alright.
The Luftwaffe bombed Leningrad for the first time, also on the 8th of September 1941. This marked the beginning of the Leningrad blockade.
Not very many.
Junkers bombers dropped over 6,000 incendiary bombs, including over 100 on the Smolny district where the Leningrad military command was based.
I'll take a revolver, why not?
The raid set off more than 150 fires. The most serious at the Badaev warehouses destroyed virtually
Yeah, we
all
were
the
in a
city's
really
food
big fight
supplies.
trying to regain some territory earlier,
Flames and smoke
and some
rising more than
fucking
3
dickhead
miles
major came
high
by
formed the
and
ideal marker for a second raid
was just
that day,
bitching the
which
entire
was to knock out
time,
the city's
and
water supply.
I guess whoever was like commanding the op that we were in told him to shut the fuck up and just play the game, and he flipped out and gave like all of our ACs to the wardens, and staff got on and
Countless
fucking
delayed action
muted me
bombs
in
were dropped
the
by parachute.
little op commander because we wouldn't
Lack of
stop
training
talking about
ensured
it.
that bomb
Didn't even
disposal
fucking do
teams
shit,
often
dude.
failed to defuse
And
them.
like 15 people got off for it. I just got back on like not too long ago.
That's crazy.
You'd think people with 1,800 commends would, you know, not have such a fragile fucking ego.
I played with a guy the other night. He had been on way too long. He's a really nice dude. He was ex-military. But he was way worked up about stuff, and really his situational awareness was gone, so it was kind of difficult. He was that way too. He's pushy as hell. Got to the point where he just run people over for no reason and shit.
Refused to push as far as they might have.
What's his name?
The disgust of the Germans and the probable
His name was Joe. It had some kind of tag to it, though.
Had the Germans and the Finns
Yeah, I see Joe all the time.
Oh, he's a great guy. I had no problem with him. I would have hung with him a little more. It was just the AC thing wasn't very useful.
The OKW.
Yeah, I think I seen him doing like a lot of like quartermaster and logi and stuff.
To the west,
Yeah, he was real on top of it at first, but he kind of, you could tell he'd been on too long.
Yeah.
Which was supplied across the
I've seen a lot of people lose their shit trying to do like 12-hour stints or 2-day stints.
To the east, a tiny
I wish I could have 2 days off of work for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, I get it sometimes, but man, I don't want to spend my limited time on Earth doing this that long.
Yeah, I agree.
It was sustained throughout the siege, its value symbolic rather than military.
Wow.
No Leningrad.
It's an awesome game for simulation reasons. You just feel like every life feels kind of significant and insignificant at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what I like about it.
He sent his most trusted general, Georgy Zhukov, to take over
Yeah,
command.
we were following this guy who,
together with Andrei Zhdanov.
like we were like way behind enemy lines, just messing around. And like if this deck is like a pillbox, you're just following him along the wall, and he just ran straight in front of it, and his name tag probably like showed up for a second, and then it disappeared.
Security was tightened.
And we were just like,
every few blocks, your papers would be checked.
That's a pillbox, and we just
if you couldn't prove your identity,
jumped on the
you'd
pillbox,
be arrested and
gone.
imprisoned. All movement.
So yeah, I mean, I can see how it would be a simulation, but
everyone lived in terror of the NKVD.
it has its moments.
The Soviet security.
Well, I was thinking of it more of a social simulation than an actual war simulation.
And guns were removed from their ships.
I mean, it's people working together that in a lot of cases are just batshit crazy or drunk.
Fleet sailors soon gained a fearsome reputation with German forces.
I think trying to get a bunch of drunk people to work together is definitely a task for the experts.
Cavalry in 1915 and becoming a sergeant. He joined the Red Army in 1918 as one of the new Red commanders. His reputation was assured with the defeat of a Japanese force at Halkin Gol in Mongolia in 1939. He'd been chief of the General Staff in the run-up to the 1941 German attack. After Barbarossa was launched, as the Red Army's most experienced combat commander, aged 44, he was needed to command in the field.
Zhukov decreed anyone who retreated from their position on the approaches to Leningrad would be executed. He threw in 2 divisions and a brigade of Marines across the river Neva to the south of the city. This offensive was the first attempt to cut through the Iron Ring around Leningrad to the east. It failed with massive casualties.
On 21st of September, Hitler issued the famous directive that Leningrad was not to be taken by storm. A week later, the German Supreme Command instructed Army Group North to tie the tightest possible ring around the city. It stated, its surrender will not be accepted. The aim was simply genocide, to let the entire encircled population die rather than escape, and then to move into the deserted city and wipe it off the face.
Hitler now diverted the tanks of von Lieb's panzer brigades to the battle from Moscow. This persuaded Stalin to recall Zhukov to deal with the threat of the Soviet attack. Von Lieb's artillery bombardment continued as heavily as before.
That's strange. You can't drive over the lip.
Yeah, that's fucking bullshit.
The Leningrad situation remained.
That's fucking bullshit.
The effect of von Leeb's advance was to split the Soviet forces dedicated to defending the area around Leningrad into two. The western part became the Leningrad front, and the eastern part waited on the Belgrade front.
Railways were crucial to the survival of Leningrad. They connected the city to the Russian
That was
harbor.
kind of freaky from that angle.
When they split the Leningrad front in two, German forces broke the direct line between Leningrad and Moscow, and the indirect one via Tikhvin. But Tikhvin remained under Soviet control.
So long as the Russians held the railway junction town of Tikhvin, some supplies were being brought in via Lake Ladoga. They were carried from the Russian heartland by railway to the ports on the lake's eastern shore, then by boat across the lake, and finally by road from the ports on the lake's western shore to the city. This route was made impassable to the Russians when von Leeb's Army Group North captured Tikhvin on November 9, 1941. Now the Russians were forced to build a new 190-mile forest supply road, skirting round the north of the new German positions.
It's the first time I've seen that camp.
Logs laid side by side.
I agree. I've actually never been in this area.
Progress through places so obscure that they did not appear on maps was bought with the lives of hundreds of peasants, collective farm workers and gulag prisoners, effectively forced labour, as well as construction battalions.
Winter came early in 1941. It proved to be one of the coldest of the century. Germans began to dig in and make themselves as comfortable as possible. In many ways, they were better equipped than their Russian counterparts, and far better provisioned than the citizens of Leningrad. The river Neva froze solid. The city's water supply failed. There was no fuel for civilian transportation. There was virtually no heating for people's homes.
Having cut the city off on 8th of September, the Germans had preempted the city's customary autumn harvest of firewood from the surrounding forests. The electricity supply was restricted to factories and military command centers.
This was the front lines.
Often there wasn't enough electricity to power official radio programs broadcast over the public address system.
Looks like there's something going on west of here.
Programs were replaced by the sound of a metronome.
Over by
This came
Barrington?
to be regarded as the heartbeat of the city. Sometimes its beat was quickened.
Oh, you're talking about
that as an air raid warning. Sometimes
Yeah, the lower barren field or whatever.
Dispiriting effect on Leningrad.
Yeah, I'll drive us over there.
On the 20th of November, the ration was cut again to 4 small slices of bread for factory workers and 2 for everyone else, except frontline troops who had 6. Leningrad scientists developed a process to use the cellulose from wallpaper paste in bread making.
Hey, you might want to lock this.
Oh yeah, very true.
Numerous infants died. The death rate rose to 5,000 per day before the official registration system broke down. No one had the strength to dig individual graves. Mass graves were blasted with dynamite. People slumped to their deaths at work, at home or in the streets, many on their way to dispose of the bodies of their relatives at one of the burial grounds scattered all over the city. To lose a ration card meant almost certain death.
The authorities would not issue duplicate ration cards because they feared that people would pretend to have lost theirs in order to get two. None of the people who had fled the Nazi invasion of the western parts of the Soviet Union were issued with ration cards. This meant there were 100,000 who had to steal or kill to survive. Under these circumstances, it had to be expected some people would resort to kill others for their meat as well as for their ration cards. According to the Central State Archive of St. Petersburg, 1,500 people were arrested for cannibalism during the siege. 886 of them during that first terrible winter of 1941 to 42.
So, who's the right?
The number of cases
who's the
increased
high-ranking
dramatically
officer?
from the end of November.
I think it's him.
Former
No?
head of state Mikhail
it's him.
Lenin, originally a Lenin brother, eventually persuaded
Oh,
Stalin
please tell me I'm not in charge.
13.
I think you are.
Oh god.
You have all these lives in your hand.
We're
Don't
doomed,
waste
man.
them.
We should probably all join the operation.
How the fuck am I corporal? I guess we're going.
Every man for himself. Anarchy.
I'm gonna keep running back and forth for these. Oh man, I don't know if I can make this while I'm disencumbered.
Exactly is up there.
Guess what?
Oh, I'm hurt. I'm not bleeding though, so that's okay.
Just for the newbie. So what he's doing, he's running inside the safe house and using the explosives on the inside because they're a lot more effective.
Get ready for the trauma, dude. I don't know if I'll make this one back.
Alright. I think someone here is a medic.
I have one.
I made it, but I can use a patch up.
Alright,
When they shoot
someone
through
here
the
on-
buildings like that, guys, it's just a sound effect. It's not really hurting you.
Alright, come here, I have stack of 7.
Yep. Here, where's it at? Here, Wolf, you gotta move. Alright, thank you.
Gentlemen,
Guys, don't go
the
too
one
far.
guy
Guys,
actually looking
back
for him.
up. You're using this thing for cover, so... Actually, this is a good idea. Somebody walk out and draw the first shot. Oh, well, I'll tell you to. Not yet, not yet. When I tell you to. Alright, you ready? Alright, do it. Do it now, do it now. Thank you, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good. You only gotta draw... You only gotta draw...
What was that, Pringles?
Oh man, alright. You have a good night, man, yeah. Thanks a bunch, you're fucking G.
Have a
Yeah,
good
see
night,
ya.
man.
Alright, you have a good one. Fucking love. Alright, fucking love, man. Alright, I got gun rod on me. mean, you know what, actually, if someone else wants to take some, I'm only going to take 3. Take the rest. Actually, I'm still fucking in cavalry here. Let me drop some. Actually, does anyone have any room for grenades? Anyone want grenades?
Yeah, I could take some grenades.
Alright, yeah, here, shit. Alright. I got 60. Alright, let's, I'm just barely in cover, actually. Does anyone have any extra weight, spare weight, that they can just take, like, quick?
Yeah, man, I can pick something up. What you need?
Alright, thanks. If you could just take, like, 5 B-mats, because we're building an outpost. They're in the thing?
Yeah, I got you. Let's go.
Thanks, sir. We will be constructing the outpost a little bit northwest of Baronstown, and then we will be blowing up a safe house north of Baronstown. I'm thinking on the other side of the road. What do you guys think?
It's your rodeo.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do it right here. Oh, I like in here. Hold on. Is there a foxhole over there? Oh shit, there's a fucking... yeah, we could bust that thing. Alright, there it is. It's open up. What's the percent? Alright, that's good ball. Alright. Alright, I'm gonna go over and get the CV, fucking English. Yeah,
Partisans in villages outside the city brought in a little more, but there was a massive shortfall.
The freezing of Lake Ladoga meant the supplies by boat would soon become impossible and would have to be replaced by some form of surface transport over the ice. On the evening of 19th of November, Captain Murov and a team of drivers and skin and bone horses set out from the western shore of Lake Ladoga across ice about a hand's breadth thick to try to prove the route. A political commissar briefed him. There are supplies in the city for 2 more days. After that, there is nothing more. The ice is very young and not very strong, but we can't wait. Each hour is dear. They made it, and on 21st of November they made it back with flour and high nutrition food. The Ladoga Ice Road, which linked with the Overland Road of Life to form Route 101, was open.
On the 22nd of November, 60 trucks crossed with over 30 tons of flour. The first 8 days brought in 800 tons. Trucks bringing in supplies to the city on their return journey carried Leningraders to safety on the lake's eastern shore. But breaking ice and aerial bombardment restricted daily deliveries to 600 tons, a fraction of what was needed.
It was obvious to the Germans that the ice road was all that was keeping Leningrad alive, and they sent out ski patrols and launched air attacks to try to cut it. At its closest, the ice road ran about 8 miles from the German-controlled shoreline. A bizarre war on the ice developed. The Russians built pillboxes out of blocks of ice and walls of ice to protect the road and anti-aircraft guns. Aerosleighs powered by aircraft engines, armed with machine guns and cannon, proved highly effective in James Bond-style battles on the vast frozen lake.
The supply line across the ice was jeopardized by a sudden thaw at the end of the month. Many trucks were lost as the ice melted.
So do we need to throw the HEs on the inside now?
No, we can go around the side where it doesn't shoot at us, and we can just blow it up
This made the loss of life sustained in the building of the corduroy road unnecessary.
Yeah,
but it also shortened the route from a major railhead to the shore of Lake Ladoga from 190 miles to 60. This was the first major successful counter-offensive against the German army by any combatant in World War II. And according to Pavlov, Leningrad's food chief saved thousands of people from starvation and probably many times more. It occurred 4 days after the Moscow counter-offensive began and 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Despite the recapture of Tiflin, Leningraders were still in the grip of mass starvation on the 9th of January 1942. It was on this day that the NKVD found 80 leaflets on one of the platforms of Leningrad's Moscow station, written by someone signing himself the Rebel. In them, he claimed that the appalling hunger Leningraders were suffering was being inflicted on them unnecessarily by their leaders. The Luftwaffe often bombarded Leningraders with Nazi propaganda leaflets. The NKVD were desperate to find out who was responsible and proceeded to check the handwriting of all 18,000 people living or working in the area, but they drew a blank.
On the 8th of March 1942, terrified of epidemics, the city authorities instituted a massive spring clean. As Leningraders cleared the streets, they found thousands of bodies. People had been left where they died for months on end. The tram service, out of action since November, was restored, mostly by Leningrad's women. A degree of normality was beginning to return. When navigation resumed, it brought an immediate increase in supplies. By the middle of April, Leningrad had enough flour for 58 days. In the same month, the Kremlin approved a pipeline under Lake Ladoga to supply the city with oil. A new system enabled tankers, usually pulled by train, to be dragged across the water. An electricity cable laid across the lake enabled factories, out of action for many weeks, to resume production. Many of the shells produced were destined not for forces fighting locally, but were commandeered by Stavka, the Soviet High Command, for use in the Moscow region. Spring came too late for some. Throughout the winter, Tanya Savicheva kept a diary. It faithfully recorded the dates and times of the deaths of her family members. The last pages read, Mama died May the 13th at 7:30 in the morning. All Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left.
After the recapture of Tiflin as part of the second attempt to break the siege, the third was the Lubani offensive from January to April 1942. Second Shock Army, attacking from the east, penetrated far into the ring but never quite cut it and became trapped. In total, 20 Russian divisions had been expended in the unsuccessful 6-month attempt to relieve Leningrad. The Deputy Front Commander, Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov, who at 41 was one of the Red Army's youngest and most highly regarded generals, was sent to take command of 2nd Shock Army and get it out. He failed, and in July was captured, one of 60,000 Soviet troops killed or taken prisoner in the pocket. The Russians had tried very hard to extricate him, but now he offered his services to the Germans forming the Russian National Liberation Army. In 1945, he surrendered to the Americans, who handed him back to the Russians to meet a traitor's death on the gallows.
To safeguard against a repeat of the previous year's shortages, every conceivable plot of land was given over to vegetable growing. Families were issued with gardening handbooks. But the truth was that Leningraders could be supplied with food more easily because there were so many fewer of them left. The reduction of the population also allowed wooden houses to be vacated and chopped up for firewood, which would be needed during the second winter of the siege. Teams of women loggers working outside the city suburbs added to this. Football matches and competitions were resumed. Results were broadcast to the Nazi troops to taunt them with how they had failed to break Leningraders' morale. Hitler now prioritized the Nazi offensive on the Soviet oil fields far to the south of Leningrad. He wanted to release as many of his forces from the siege as possible. On the 6th of July, he made the beginning of September the deadline for the destruction of Leningrad and sent in even heavier artillery. No one suffered more from the increased bombardment than the children still in the city. To maximize its military effort, Zhdanov and the military council decided to reduce the city's population to 800,000 and ordered the evacuation of a further 300,000, mostly children.
Scan this bad one out.
Some reached safety, but many didn't. The lightly armed boats were easy targets for the Luftwaffe. Tanya Savicheva was among the evacuees, but like many others, she would soon die from the famine's after effects. The composer, Dmitri Shostakovich, was evacuated from Leningrad at the beginning of the siege, but he continued working on his 7th Symphony, the Leningrad. On the 9th of August 1942, it was given its Leningrad premiere. This was commemorated 25 years later with a performance by the few survivors from the original orchestra. Nazi troops were listening to the original concert. Their commander ordered artillery to shell the concert.
Hey, that's fine, that's fine. Yo, we're gonna go build a fucking outpost, Chief.
The commander in charge of Russian artillery...
Chief, thank you. We're gonna go build an outpost.
Shostakovich's 7th Symphony was Leonid Govorov. He had taken over as Leningrad Front Commander in June 1942. Under duress, Govorov had briefly served with the White Army in the Russian Civil War. Despite the fact that he defected to the Red Army and took his artillery battery with him, he narrowly escaped the Tsarist purges of the 1930s, which sought to eradicate Tsarist elements from the Soviet military. Govorov had distinguished himself during the Battle of Moscow as commander of the 5th Army. As an artillery specialist, he understood the siege warfare that raged on.
Zhdanov believed that 3 failed attempts to lift the siege had taken such a toll on Leningrad's morale that he had German prisoners paraded down.
If this thing moved any slower on the grass than it did a road, I would not deal with this thing. I would just fucking kill myself.
Alright, let's go. The first week of December 1942,
forces you to protect it too. That
Thank you, Asher.
Prepare for war game number 5.
The operation was also known as Iskra, the Spy, the name of the first Russian Social Democratic newspaper.
Yeah, there you
Preparations
go.
were made in secret. Troop movements were restricted to small groups. Iskra units were forbidden to use radio. After some delays, Operation Iskra began at 9:30 a.m. on the 12th of January 1943.
Wow, you're heterosexual. Fucking get him.
Opened up on the Nazis. The barrage lasted 2 hours, 20 minutes. At 11:42, a green rocket induced one infantry division to attack before the Katyushas had finished firing. But somehow it got across the ice intact. On the 16th of January, the distance between the two Soviet fronts was reduced to just 3/4 of a mile. 2 days later, the two fronts joined together. Finally, there was a break in the blockade.
Наших войск в районе южнее Ладожского озера и прорыв блокады Ленинграда.
In Operation Iskra, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts attacked the German forces in the wedge between them. The Germans were driven out of the area immediately to the south of Lake Ladoga, and Soviet forces regained the key town of Shlisselburg. Here they constructed a new bridge nearly a mile long across the river Neva and built a temporary railway line that connected Leningrad with the line to Tigray. On the 7th of February, the first train reached Leningrad via the Shlisselburg Bridge, loaded with much-needed food supplies. But like the city, the railway was under constant German fire throughout 1943 and was cut countless times. Bombardments were heavier than ever. Shelling always took place during the morning and evening rush hours to maximize civilian casualties. Nearly a quarter of Leningrad's housing was flattened.
By now, food supplies were reaching Leningrad from the USA under the American aid scheme known as Lend-Lease, and to a lesser extent from the United Kingdom. Nonetheless, the rebel continued his campaign against the authorities. But he had started
Look what I found.
He sent Zhdanov a letter in a
I'm back.
envelope
I'm grabbing shit.
Sekretka, complaining as a worker in a hot factory about the distribution of food coupons. One of the two districts where Sekretkas were still on sale
Thanks, man.
had a
You're a real one. You're a real one.
The NKVD homed in. They checked
Want your radio back?
lockers and handwriting.
Preferably, yes,
Handwriting of
please.
worker number 42, and Sergei Yushkov, matched the writing on the rebels' letters.
There you go, buddy.
Thank you very much.
He was arrested and interrogated, revealing that he had no connection with the Germans. And on 12th of December 1943, the Leningrad prosecutor, Kubatkin, declared the case closed.
In late November 1942, the Red Army broke through the northern flank of Hitler's forces around Stalingrad and encircled nearly 250,000 men. Many trapped inside the city gave themselves up. On the 31st of January 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered the day after Hitler had promoted him to field marshal. Over 90,000 Nazi troops were taken prisoner. The Soviet victory was hailed as the turning point in the war by the world's press.
Immediately after the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, the Russians launched another operation, Polar Star, to push the Germans further from Leningrad. Like Uranus and Little Saturn, the successful Stalingrad operations, it had a cosmic codename, and like those, it was envisaged as a double encirclement, with the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts cutting off German forces still close to Lake Ladoga. And then, a week later, the northwest front would launch a wider attack, trapping the German 18th Army.
But the Soviets were forced to divert forces to the south, where the Germans were pushing them back to create the Great Curse of Salient. This would become the focus of the war in the summer of 1943. As a consequence, Operation Polar Star failed, and the relief of Leningrad was postponed once again.
Almost there. Well, almost as in fucking 130.
It wasn't until January 1944 that the operation to break the blockade completely, codenamed Niev, finally began.
At the beginning of Operation Nieva, the Germans were still at their closest point to Leningrad, just 6 miles from the city. When the ice hardened, the Russians began secretly moving troops, ammunition and equipment across the river Nieva into the Oranian.
85?
For the first time, an offensive would be launched out of that pocket in concert with one from Leningrad itself.
70, we're almost there.
Soviet aircraft bombed Nazi trenches and forward installations. Victories in other theatres of the war enabled Stalin to provide a more powerful force than at Stalingrad. Soviet forces now outnumbered Army Group North by more than 500,000 men. Ground forces drove a wedge between 1 and 3 miles deep into the Nazi lines on a 3-mile front. Soon German troops were retreating in complete disorder, often into the
Got
hands of
ammunition.
behind their lines.
Not a lot of shit. Yeah. What are you gonna do?
Ammo's ammo, I guess.
Yeah.
Red Army troops met little resistance as they moved forward, taking possession of one Nazi position after another, driving on to the city's suburbs. The Leningrad blockade was finally lifted on the 27th of January 1944. The longest siege in history, lasting 872 days, and responsible for more than 1 million deaths, was over.
Говорит Ленинград радио. Блокада прорвана! Поздравляем вас, дорогие!
Within a year of the war, the extent of the suffering and heroism of ordinary Leningraders was suppressed to conceal the incompetence of their leaders and preserve Moscow's preeminence. But at the time, Leningraders' celebrations were unrestrained.
Soviet resistance to the siege of Leningrad not only preserved the lives of 2/3 of the city's population, but it had a massive effect on the German offensive. From 9th of July to 26th of September 1941, 38 German and Finnish divisions were involved in the operations to encircle the city. That is 500,000 troops. After the siege of Leningrad, the war on the Eastern Front was to continue for a further 16 months. It was fought on a front 2,000 miles long, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Caucasus. In 1941-42, the Soviets suffered defeats on the approaches to Moscow at Minsk, Smolensk, Sevastopol, Kharkov, and were driven all the way back to the River Volga. On the best estimates, combined military and civilian Soviet deaths exceeded 27 million. When the war in Eastern Europe was over, the Japanese still had control of much of Eastern Asia. While the Tokyo government and the civilian population were devastated by United States atomic bombs, the Red Army defeated the million-strong Imperial Kwantung Army in Manchuria and brought Japanese military resistance to its end.
PBS America's looking at the terror and triumph of the D-Day landings and the bitterness of the fighting in the days that followed. That's at 10:05 tomorrow. Next, we've the hard luck story of a luxury liner, the Britannic.
I have just done something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt could never do on any day of his 12-year presidency. (1945). As the global war reached its devastating climax, Franklin Roosevelt was the supreme figure of the wartime alliance, but also a man living on borrowed time. The images of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin meeting at Yalta are well known. What may be less familiar, given his appearance, is the fact that the American president was by some years the youngest of the big four.
Oh well.
Roosevelt's health was collapsing. Sapped by chronic heart disease and by 2 decades as a secret paraplegic. One wartime American general nicknamed him Rubber Legs. But few Americans were aware that their president could not walk unaided, or that he'd been diagnosed as being on the brink of cardiac failure. And in Roosevelt's complicated personal life, other skeletons lay hidden in the cupboard. His formidable yet fragile wife, Eleanor, had supported him through his long battle with disability. But their marriage was now coming under increasing strain, for Roosevelt was living a dark secret. About an affair exposed and ended 25 years ago, but now resurrected in wartime by a president isolated in the loneliness of power. Despite all these very human flaws, however, the public Roosevelt stands as one of America's most remarkable presidents. He crafted a New Deal to drag America out of the Depression of the 1930s. Amid the catastrophe of World War II, he envisioned a New Deal to redeem the whole world.
We are going to win the war, and we are going to win the peace that follows.